The attack will be ruthlessly pressed to the limit. This will be the end of the defensive battles we have fought for the past 2 months. From now on, we attack. We must succeed. Go back to your men and tell them just this. General Charles Mangin, French 10th Army, commanding, June 10th, 1918. Hey folks, welcome to the Battles of the First World War podcast. Second Marne, Mangin on the Matz. Trench maintenance issues up first. Well, off the beaten track news and a safety tip. We've issued this safety briefing on the podcast before, but apparently it is going to become a yearly thing now. It's really awkward, folks. If you are even somewhat online, you have no doubt come across the likely, terminally embarrassed 24-year-old Frenchman from Toulouse who made for interesting World War I related news recently. If you do not know, then simply look up 24-year-old Frenchman plus Toulouse, France plus World War I shell, and you should be directed to what I'm talking about. I'm sure you can already guess where we're going. Folks, to me, love is an unconditional thing. That's where I stand. And how that love is expressed is really none of my business. Like, really, really none of my business. However, as a World War I podcast and a former NCO, it strikes me as negligent if I don't mention this, since World War I era ordnance is involved in this particular case. Here we are again. Look, folks, if you're out in the French countryside and you see unexploded ordnance, like a 155 shell in the Moleville ravine, or maybe an old gas shell somewhere, take a photo to show your friends, but that is the limit of your interaction with it. Don't touch it, don't kick it, don't put it in your pocket, and for the love of all good things, do not put it anywhere else. As my German landlady used to say to me, Verstehen? Verstanden. Man, there's really no smooth way to change the subject here. Okay, folks on Patreon, by now, you have hopefully seen that there is an exclusive episode for you on Bretons and the Chemin des Dames. If not, well, there is an exclusive episode waiting for you on Patreon. If exclusive content sounds exciting to you, and you would like to support the podcast, please check out the link to the Patreon page in the episode notes. Supporting the BFWWP on Patreon can literally be cheaper than picking up a medium regular at Dunkin', if you know what I mean. And let's give a shout out to the latest patrons on Patreon. Chris, Bryn, William, and Srini. Thank you so very much for your support. Folks, supporting the podcast on Patreon and PayPal is a real help to the podcast, and I always appreciate it. But I find myself needing help of another kind at the moment, and I've learned a lesson here. Recently, on a Facebook page named World War I Buffs, someone posted the question, what are some good World War I podcasts to listen to? Some 30 comments or so had been submitted before I saw it, so you can naturally sense my excitement at hopefully seeing the BFWWP mentioned in there. About 2/3 of the way down, listener Steve J. suggested the BFWWP, for which I greatly thank you, sir. Steve's was the only mention of the podcast on that thread. Now, in the past, I would have thought things the way the Army trained me. I would have chided myself for not doing enough to get the word out. Somewhere, there was something that I missed and should have done. And that is partially correct. There is something I missed. I haven't asked for help. The Army and just life in general has taught me that you need to do every possible thing within your power, as long as you are able to do so, for whatever task demands it. Well, sometimes, after you have tried everything on your own, the next thing you need to do is ask for help. That is the lesson I picked up from this tiny interaction. Folks, if you enjoy the podcast, there is a way you can support it that does not involve money. It just takes a bit of your time. If you like the podcast, please share it on social media. Tell your friends to follow the podcast on iTunes, tell your family members, or write a review. There's all sorts of ways to help to get the word out. For example, you could attend a bingo game and just yell out bingo so that you can then announce this great World War I podcast you really like. Or you could stare at some tattooed biker guy in a bar until he sees you and probably menacingly comes over to you, and then you would say, "Just wanted to see if you like podcasts, because if you do, my friend, do I have one for you." Well, maybe not like that last scenario, but look, help get the word out about the BFWWP. Seriously, the content will keep coming, but I do need help spreading the word. All right, let's take a look at an area to the northwest of the new German salient on the Marne. The Chemin des Dames front was still rumbling and roiling with hate and discontent in the first week of June 1918, when the German army set its jaundiced eye on another target for attack. With its just culminated attack of May 27th through June 5th, the Germans now had two ungainly salients that General David Zabecki has described as a loosely formed letter M, Mike in the military alphabet. One at Saint-Quentin, northeast of the Somme, and the new one pointed at the Marne. A new attack aimed at the ground between the two salients would straighten the line out, make the Soissons rail line usable for the Germans, and continue the drive to Paris. This ground was the area between Montdidier and Noyon, through which runs the river Matz. German Army Commander Erich Ludendorff needed to keep his eyes on the strategic goal of all of these attacks, that of drawing away Allied reserves from Flanders so that the main attack of Unternehmen Hagen could split the French away from the British. Ludendorff, however, thought that after the Chemin des Dames disaster he'd inflicted on the French, that the road to Paris was open. Here was the plan. The German 18th Army, led by General Oskar von Hutier, had already received the warning order on June 7th that it was to prepare to attack. Hutier, with 15 divisions, was to attack over the river Matz, which runs west of the river Oise. Immediately facing him were 9 French divisions. Von Hutier's divisions were to, quote, advance across the Fretois-Rollo-Matz-Bach line, if possible, in one continuous movement, end quote. The Germans would pivot on Montdidier to the lower Matz, and once they reached the line running Montdidier to Compiègne, the attack front would be shortened to 11 divisions. This would leave 7 divisions in support. From there, with Compiègne reached, the Germans could dig in if necessary, or they could drive straight down to Paris. It would depend on how things went. This new attack front was located between the towns of Montdidier to the west and Noyon to the east. The eastern boundary of the battlefield would be the river Oise, where heavy woods formed natural barriers. Through the center of the front, the river Matz made a big loop to a point about 13 kilometers from both Noyon to the north and Compiègne in the south, and here the river emptied into the Oise. From the big loop of the Matz, the front ran west along the Lassigny-Boulogne Massif to the northern end of the river. To the west, the ground was more open. To the south lay flat farmland with wooded copses, similar to what you would see on the Somme. This area was, in fact, the meeting point of the Oise and Picardy departments. And by River Matz, of course, you will remember it's a river in France. It's not the Meuse, the Marne, or the Seine. The River Matz runs about 10 feet wide and 3 feet deep. It was overgrown right up to the edge of the water. So, before we get too much further in, let's answer the question that may be popping up in your mind. Why are we talking about what will be known as the Battle of the Matz? I've got a couple of answers for you. One is that, well, this is the BFWWP, and we always take a long time to cover one battle. I can't help it. I just want to talk about everything, and I want you folks to know everything there is to know about World War I. The second reason is that this German attack will see a different French response this time, and that response will have effects on 2nd Marne. We should also take a few moments to address German General Oskar von Hutier and the Hutier tactics named after him. Mentions of the Hutier tactics are found in older publications, and an article titled The Hutier Legend by Laszlo M. Alfoldi ascribes its origins to the French and the Allied press that emulated the French. These tactics are the decentralized stormtroop infantry tactics so successful in the 1918 battles, and the centralized artillery tactics used in those same battles. Here's the thing, though. These tactics were not devised by General Hutier, though he was a capable leader and battlefield commander. It is actually a French officer in 1915, Captain André Lafargue, who wrote of innovative new infantry ideas in a pamphlet that was later captured by the Germans. The French didn't care for their captain's ideas, but the Germans sure did. On a parallel track, German Hauptmann Willy Rohr began experimenting with new tactics around the same time. And all of the artillery tactics, being rather brilliantly executed, were centered around the ideas of an obscure and otherwise unremarkable German lieutenant colonel named Georg Bruchmüller. Oskar von Hutier was one of the more successful German generals of the war, and his success got press coverage. So it was inevitable that the Allies began to sit up and take notice of Hutier and his battlefield wins. Alfoldi's article posits that, quote, perhaps the French had to rely on incomplete and inaccurate information from the front, and therefore made an educated guess as to the origin of the successful German tactics, end quote. As American post-war studies and monographs generally cited French sources, the Hutier tactics legend crossed the Atlantic and lived in American military circles as well. Going back to our pending battle, the Germans weren't at their best with the preparations for the Matz attack, which would be known as Unternehmen Gneisenau, named after Field Marshal August Neidhart von Gneisenau. Gneisenau would be paired by a later attack executed by the neighboring 7th Army, which would be known as Unternehmen Hammerschlag, Hammerstrike. General Erich Ludendorff wrote of having to delay the Gneisenau attack from the outset. Quote, during a meeting at the headquarters of the 18th Army at the beginning of June, I became convinced that their artillery preparations would not be completed in time. The attack was therefore postponed until June 9th. This was disadvantageous because it increasingly distanced it from the tactical context of the massive battle between the Aisne and the Marne, for which a local attack southwest of Soissons could not be a fully adequate substitute. It also made it easier for the enemy to redeploy their reserves. Despite these concerns, I accepted the later date, as I had to place decisive importance on the thorough preparation of the attack in consideration of its success and the losses." End quote. On top of the delay, it was hard to hide the hasty preparations this time, and so the Germans lost a rather precious part of their plan: secrecy. Von Hutier only received his warning order on the 7th of June, shortly after the German 7th and 1st Armies went into a defensive posture just to the east. Part of the 2 days' delay was the need to move 600 artillery batteries, thousands of individual artillery pieces, and their ammunition over to the new attack front. Getting 15 divisions worth of soldiers in position was also a task that was hard to hide, even if those divisions were doubtless well below their authorized strength by that time. The RAF 9th Brigade, flying over this part of the front, reported heavy traffic in troop columns behind the Matz front. It was such a dead giveaway that French military intelligence analysts thought the whole thing a crude ruse. German deserters, however, gave up the attack plans under interrogation. Then the French realized they were about to get hit again, and that this was for real, for real. Holding that sector from Montdidier to the village of Moulins, southeast of Noyon, was the French Third Army, commanded by General Louis Humbert. This was about a 30-kilometer front held with 4 corps in the line, and there were 7 divisions in reserve. The French Third Army had been here since the end of the First German Offensive in March, and was another formation exempted by French Army Commander General Philippe Pétain from having to implement defense-in-depth measures along its front. The Third Army's front line was thus heavily manned, and the first-line trenches were on forward slopes without dugouts and communication trenches. Behind the front line was an incomplete intermediate line that had strong belts of barbed wire. A second trench system lay 2.5 kilometers behind the intermediate line, but it too was as yet incomplete. A third trench system had been traced in the ground along the south bank of the river Aronde, north of Compiègne. General Humbert, another elastic defense skeptic, had made no changes after the disaster of 6th Army to his right just under 2 weeks ago. On June 4th, Pétain changed track and ordered defense-in-depth implemented on 3rd Army's front. General Émile Fayolle, commander of the GAR, Groupe d'Armée de Réserve, overseeing Humbert's 3rd Army, wanted the men in the frontline trenches thinned out considerably. General Humbert attempted to adapt, and he ordered his units to begin digging a new trench system well to the rear of the front line. But there was confusion between him and Pétain as to where the line of resistance should be. And all of this was further compounded when now Allied Supreme Commander Marshal Ferdinand Foch issued a lofty directive on June 6th that said, amongst other things, quote, "The road to Paris must be denied. Possession must be kept of the northern ports and railways. There must be indissoluble liaison between the Allied armies." End quote. There would also be a foot-by-foot defense of the ground, and that blew up the whole defense-in-depth talk. Foch was letting it be known to Pétain, as well as Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig of the BEF, that he was in charge now, and that his word would now be final. Foch began moving both British and French reserves around, moves that ticked off both Haig and Pétain. But 3rd Army was given 165 tanks positioned in the open ground south of the Matz, and 1,200 Allied planes were already in the skies fighting the Germans. Half of these planes were bombers too, which promised to help disrupt German preparations and movements once the attack was underway. One thing that Foch and Pétain could agree on was the need for the French to counterattack as soon as the opportunity presented itself after the Germans attacked. Foch came at it from an offensive à outrance mindset, and Pétain came at it from the defense-in-depth principles of luring the enemy into a kill zone and then attacking from the flanks as soon as possible. The tanks allotted to Humbert's Third Army, a mix of Schneiders and Saint-Chamands, were to be part of that counterattack. Thanks to the German deserters, the French, like at the Chemin des Dames, knew what time the German artillery preparation would start, 00 hours on 9 June 1918. Just like last time, they intended to surprise the Germans with counterfire. At 10 minutes to midnight on 8th June, the French guns opened up across the Matz front. Zabecki writes in his book Steel Wind that the Germans actually opened up at the same time as the French. Well, either way, just before midnight, the darkness erupted as thousands of artillery pieces belched forth across the heavens. Zabecki writes that the French counterfire had little effect, but H. Issam wrote that the German infantry attack would get off to a disjointed start because of it. The French artillery fire may or may not have been effective here, but the German bombardment was a classic of Bruchmüller's techniques. Between midnight and 0320, the Germans plastered the Matz front with 1.4 million shells, fully 1/3 of which were gas. To think of how far things had come along in World War I, recall that just under 2 years before, in June 1916, the BEF had taken a week to fire 1.7 million shells on the Somme front. The bombardment flailed the French frontline trenches, which were still far too heavily manned. When the barrage lifted at 0320, the Germans cut right through the front lines with their tested stormtroop units, leaving the regular infantry further behind to mop up points of resistance. Featured in the assault were A7Vs, the only tank the Germans built during the war. The Germans seemed to have begun another offensive that was going their way yet again. By noon, they were at the French line of resistance, which they also broke through. By evening, German troops had pushed forward nearly 10 kilometers, destroying 3 French divisions and bagging 8,000 prisoners. They were across the river Matz on a wide front south of the village of Soissons, with 2/3 of the French 2nd Trench position now in their hands. While French reserve divisions had stopped them for the day, General von Hutier and his staff still considered it a good day. There was no reason the advance should not continue the next day. While the French divisions had given way under the crushing weight of German artillery and infantry assaults, this wasn't a collapse like the 6th Army on the Chemin des Dames. The poilus pulled back in a disciplined manner, and Army Group Commander General Fayolle immediately released 3 divisions to head up to the front. General Pétain had no reserves to release, as Foch would not allow it. Humbert and his Third Army would have to make do with what they had, but he and Fayolle were already working on a counterattack plan. On June 10th, the Germans continued to push forward past the Matz in the center of the front, but they did so in a violent hailstorm of French artillery. Their advance was limited to a further 3 or 4 kilometers. They did have success against the French 53rd Division, which was holding the center right of the line at Tiscourt village. The poilus of the 53rd fell apart and fell back, and the neighboring 72nd Division to the right had to pull back as well in order to maintain the line. The 18th Corps, to which these 2 French divisions belonged, now had its flank in the air. General Humbert ordered the 18th Corps to pull back several kilometers to the line of the Forêt de l'Aigle, and thus denied the Germans the ability to attack and try to break through there. Hutier had to continue pushing the western flank of the attack, as the French were now buttressed against a forest to the east. This is where things stopped going well for the German 18th Army, because Generals Humbert and Fayolle were marshalling their 3 reserve divisions as well as the 165 tanks. 2 other developments added to this pool of striking power. 1, General Pétain was authorized to rush 2 more infantry divisions up to the Matz front. 2, in the words of French blogger Jean-Philippe Reynaud at the Acier et Tranchées blog, was, quote, "Les diables Mangin ressortent de sa boîte." The devil Mangin comes out of his box. It was amusing to read this description of General Charles Mangin's rehabilitation in June 1918. This is why I wanted to do this episode, because this is where Les Bouchers, Les Mangeurs d'Hommes, was brought back on active duty. When I was first reading about the Matz, I was reminded of one of the Hannibal Lecter films where the authorities bring him out in a straitjacket and a demented hockey-style mask. So to see Monsieur Reynaud write of Mangin as a devil being released, well, I thought that was pretty appropriate. Following his relief from command in 1917, after the disastrous Nivelle offensive, General Charles Mangin was brought back on duty and given command of the French 10th Army on June 7, 1918. Before he could attend to 10th Army, he was sent to the Matz front to lead the French counterattack there. It was felt that Mangin's bristling, boiling energy and innate capability for violence were the right combination needed to execute a counterpunch against General von Hutier's 18th Army. And yes, Mangin was the man for the moment. Mangin was given the 3 reserve divisions, the fleet of tanks, and the 2 new divisions rushing up to the front. It would not be possible to execute a pincer attack on the German gains, so the French would attack from the west in the direction of the village of Soissons. Mangin refused to wait for the 2 extra divisions, despite their commanders asking for time to offload the troops and get them ready. Mangin, in command of the 35th Corps for the counterattack, relayed the opening quote to this episode to his subordinate division commanders. No more waiting. The time to hit back was now. The poilus of those divisions would jump off their trucks and run straight into battle. On the morning of June 11th, French artillery thundered across the Matz front at 10:30 a.m. The guns fired out a rolling barrage that shifted 100 meters up every 2 minutes, tearing up forward German positions. The poilus of the 129th, 152nd, 165th, and 48th Divisions jumped off to the attack, having been told to charge forward and not wait for the tanks. Above them, Allied planes flew overhead to strafe German positions to the southwest of Soissons, as well as any German observation balloons found floating and any troop columns found in the open. After months of retreat and losses and disappointment, the morning started with the French jabbing the German 18th Army right in the face. Von Hutier's men felt the sting, and under the roar of the guns and the metallic rattle of machine guns, the ground trembled. Any German who had dealt with that growing rumble before knew what it was: tanks. Echeloned in and behind the French infantry were batteries of French Schneider and Saint-Chamond tanks. The French had one groupement of several tank batteries attached to each attacking division. The tank batteries can be thought of as tank platoons, having around 4 tanks to a battery. The batteries were part of groups, which are equivalent to tank companies. Many of the attacking French units had not trained to work with tanks, and several of the tanks broke down on the way to the battle. However, as the remaining tanks approached German positions, they quickly began proving their worth. The lumbering beasts poured out machine gun and shell fire on German machine gun nests, which greatly helped clear the way for the infantry. Major de Violet, commander of the Groupement 10, attached to the 129th Division on the French left, advised his Saint-Chamond commanders, in case of doubt, do not hesitate to fire the cannon. In the center of the French 4-division front, the 152nd and 165th Divisions were next to each other, left to right. The 152nd was attacking from west to east in the direction of the villages of Méry and Couvilly. The division had 2 regiments abreast with 3 Schneider tank groups and 1 regiment and tank group in reserve. The poilus and the tanks crossed the line of departure, a rail line some 3 to 4 kilometers west of Méry, at 1000 on the 11th of June. The Schneiders squealed and clanked through the fields, and the center group made contact with some French troops holding the houses on the western and southwestern edge of Méry village. From there, 1 tank battery chugged up the main street of the village, blasting German machine gun positions and even taking some prisoners. German machine gun fire in the village was intense. 2 other tank batteries also attacked Méry from the south, while a 3rd battery flanked and attacked from the north. It was a fight for the village. Group AS-1 reached the Église Notre-Dame de la Nativité in the center of town, and then saw 2 of its tanks knocked out by German artillery. By noon, the Germans held only the eastern part of Méry, but they continued putting up quite the fight for it. The support group in reserve had reached the fighting by then, and these tanks now unleashed their firepower on 2 German counterattacks, destroying both. The Germans, shaken by the suddenness of the attack, recovered and began to hammer tanks in the open north of Méry with heavy artillery. Around noon, the infantry stopped and dug in, and the remaining tanks took out any German machine guns they could locate. Southeast of Méry, surviving tanks continued pushing across the fields, but they took heavy fire from Bellois village and the Bois-Val-la-Ploie. The German counterattack was destroyed by the French tanks, which now crossed the Méry-Resson D938 road. The Germans now began using their 77mm guns to fire directly at the tanks, and Schneiders began to explode. By 1330, 3 tank groups had had their tanks knocked out or immobilized, but the remaining group continued engaging enemy targets. Just southeast of Méry, the 165th Division and Groupement 12's Saint-Chamonds set their sights on Bellois village. Part of the 287th Regiment and 1 tank group would attack to the north, seizing or subduing the north edge of Bellois and the western edge of L'Étang village to the east. The other part of the 287th, with another tank group, would attack Bellois' southern end and the nearby Bois de l'Étang. The 154th Regiment would attack west of Bellois with 1 tank group. As these regiments had never worked with tanks before, the tank battery commanders would be the physical communication link between the tankers and the infantry. They would run between the tanks and the poilus during the operation. Remember that this will be happening as the Germans are actively shooting at them. These guys were made of some really tough stuff. The infantry jumped off at 1100 as thousands of shells whistled overhead and plowed the German-held earth ahead of them. The Germans laid down heavy fire and the poilus went to ground. It took the tanks 2 hours to reach them and move past them, and a couple of tanks were lost. One broke down, and the other literally got lost and joined another battery. The battle for Bellois village was as tough as the fight for Méry nearby. Seeing a mix of groups AS-37s, Schneiders, and Saint-Chamonds maneuvering on the north end of Bellois, 1 battery commander decided to move his tanks south in order to outflank the village. As they moved south, they took fire from the western end of the village, and they returned fire. Losing a tank to an artillery hit that immobilized it, the remaining tanks settled in a formation, and pumped fire into Bellois for the next hour and a half. The last battery of AS-37 joined in the fight for the village and lost 2 tanks to hits. It had already lost 1 tank that morning to a breakdown. Bellois village was taken, although it remained part of the front line. The fight became a grueling match, with both French and Germans pummeling each other. The Germans had been caught a bit off guard, but they were adapting rapidly to a situation where they were no longer in charge. To the south of the village, Group AS-38 had one hell of a slugging match. From Tim Gale's book, French Tanks of the Great War, quote, Captain Bruneau, who we have seen fighting at Malmaison, was now in charge of Groupement 12's AS-38 with 12 Saint-Chamons, the group being known as the Crocodiles. Having spent the night under camouflage positions near Saint-Martin-au-Bois, Bruneau's group set off as planned, advancing in column across the Menevier plain quite easily. Bruneau thought the noise from the French barrage was infernal. Although the German artillery had reacted strongly to the French advance, the tanks were not hit, and Bruneau deployed his 3 batteries facing the objective, in line, behind a line of French infantry that were unable to advance further. At Bruneau's signal, the line of tanks moved forward in line at full speed towards the Bois de Bellois. Podcaster note, as far as I can tell from map searches, Bois de Bellois is really Bois de Genlis, which is physically located right next to Bellois village, and makes sense for the story. One battery advanced into the southwest corner of the woods, destroying a German machine gun and allowing the infantry to enter the woods. Heavy fighting then commenced, the Germans putting up serious resistance but seemingly unable to stop the tanks. However, a single German field gun then opened fire, and in several minutes 4 tanks were immobilized, although the woods were captured despite the setback. The battery on the left attacked L'Atoll village, but only 1 tank got into the village, where it got stuck against a wall and was subsequently captured by the Germans. Bruneau stopped for an hour to regroup the tanks of his group, but he was only able to find 2 combat-ready tanks. Commandant Azé ordered Bruneau to stand down and for his tanks to remain in place as the infantry could not advance any further. During the night, a rapid salvage operation was mounted and 6 tanks were recovered, the group then returning to Saint-Martin-au-Bois. End quote. Most of the remaining tanks pulled back in the evening. The day had been an expensive one for the French tanks, with fully half of the original 165 broken down or disabled or destroyed by enemy fire. Casualties amongst the tankers had been considerable. The next day, June 12th, both sides attacked again. The Germans, stinging from the previous day's blows, tried to stay on plan. The neighboring 7th Army launched a 2-corps attack with 5 divisions striking west from Soissons in the direction of Compiègne. The French replied with a brutal firestorm of artillery that quickly stopped Unternehmen Hammerschlag in its tracks, and each side settled into hammering the other with relentless shelling. The 12th and 13th saw the French launch new assaults with the remaining tanks, and a hill here and a wood there were wrenched from German control. By the end of June 13th, the German offensives Gneisenau and Hammerschlag were both over. The French had taken some 40,000 casualties in 4 days, and the Germans perhaps around 25,000. However, a subtle but seismic shift had occurred on the Western Front. The French army had hit back. On a front of 8 kilometers, the poilus had pushed the Germans back an average of 3 kilometers. It wasn't a spectacular knockout blow, but they had shown that with their proper panache, they could deliver some effective strikes. Pétain's directive to counterattack on the flanks once the enemy had been drawn in by elastic defense had been shown to work, if imperfectly. Mangin had only been able to attack on one flank at the Matz, but it had been a stinging blow. The French counterattack also showed that General Charles Mangin still had his uses. While his forces had suffered 11,000 casualties in 2 days, he had put the Germans on the back foot. He had shown French soldiers that they were still quite capable of attacking and winning. This quickly enacted attack plan would be seen again, and troops and commanders simply had to respond to the breakneck pace. Tim Gale writes in French Tanks of the Great War that the counterattack was both successful because of its rapid planning and implementation, but that it also suffered because of that rapid planning and implementation. Some of the units were rushed into battle, and while this surprised the tired Germans, it also made it difficult to plan and execute the operation on the French side. Still, this was the way things would likely be from now on. Whoever could surprise the enemy would have a fleeting advantage on their side. The French tank force had also demonstrated what the steel beasts could do when properly applied. A captured German major told his French captors, "It is not men you have in your tanks. They're much more than that." The tanks had shown their potential in taking out machine gun nests and driving straight into fortified villages to blast the enemy out, nest by house by building, and the infantry had done much better with their aid. The main problem with the tanks was that while their potential was incredible, the vehicles of the day were woefully inadequate for the job needed. Many of the tanks simply broke down, and the ones that made it through the fight desperately needed maintenance afterwards. The tank force had learned a lot, although it had been learned the hard way. The tankers had learned that while they provided great support to the infantry, they themselves needed great support from the artillery. Close artillery support was needed to neutralize the German artillery that was proving to be deadly on the battlefield. Closer cooperation was needed with the infantry as well, and the poilus needed to recognize the opportunities the tanks provided by blowing holes in German defenses. There needed to be better observation and communication between planes and infantry too. Amongst the tanks themselves, the tankers learned that it was important to work in batteries/platoons at a minimum. The combined firepower 4 tanks could provide could give the overwhelming local edge needed in a firefight. More training would remedy these issues. The French were all over the lessons the Battle of the Matz had to offer, and they quickly set to work drawing up lessons learned directives and distributing them to units in the field. Mangin would be sure that his tanks would have adequate artillery support in the future, a future that was mere weeks away. Questions, comments, or concerns, please don't hesitate to contact me at verdunpodcast@gmail.com. Get at me on Blue Sky at www.podcast.bsky.social, and check out the BFWWP website, firstworldwarpodcast.com. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you again soon. Take care.